Let's start with something very simple, almost too simple to notice. Right now, as you're watching this, it probably feels like you are sitting somewhere behind your eyes, looking out at the world. There's a sense of being located, a feeling of, here I am, and everything else is out there. We almost never question this because it feels obvious, like asking whether gravity exists while you're standing on the ground. But let me ask a strange question anyway. Where exactly is you? Not your body, not your name, not your memories or personality. I mean the thing that experiences, the part that hears these words, understands them, and feels like it is present. If I asked you to point to it, you'd probably point to your head. Some people point to their chest. But if I pressed a little further and asked, which part? Things would start to get uncomfortable. Is it one neuron? A group of neurons? A particular place in the brain? If we zoom in far enough, all we find are cells, chemicals, and electrical signals. No matter how carefully we look, there's no obvious place where the experience itself is sitting. This is not just a philosophical puzzle. It's something we can test. Neuroscientists have spent decades studying the brain in enormous detail. They can identify areas involved in vision, language, memory, emotion, and movement. They can even predict, to some extent, what you're going to see or do by watching brain activity. And yet, nowhere in all that machinery is there a little person watching the screen of your life. There's no control room, no inner observer, no central you pulling the strings. That should bother us because despite all that, experience clearly exists. You are hearing these words. You are aware. Something is happening. The mystery isn't whether experience is real. The mystery is why it feels like there's a single someone at the center of it all. Here's a helpful way to think about it. Imagine you're watching a movie. There's a screen, speakers, light, electricity, and a long chain of technology behind it. Now ask yourself, where is the movie? It's not in the screen alone. Turn off the speakers and the movie disappears. Cut the power and it vanishes completely. The movie isn't a thing you can point to. It's something that happens when all the parts interact in the right way. The sense of, maybe like that. Not a separate object inside the brain, but an event, a process. Something that emerges when perception, memory, emotion, and attention work together. When the system is running, it feels like there's a solid center. When it stops, as in deep sleep or anesthesia, that center vanishes without leaving a trace. The strange part is that evolution gave us no reason to notice this. Feeling like a single, stable self is incredibly useful. It helps us make decisions quickly, take responsibility, and survive. Questioning the nature of the self doesn't help you dodge a car or find food, so the brain doesn't naturally do it. And so we grow up assuming the most convincing illusion of all that there is a you. Inside your head, separate from the rest of the world, quietly watching everything go by. If you open up a brain and look inside, you don't find anything that looks like a self. You find tissue, cells, connections, and a lot of electrical and chemical activity. That already tells us something important. Whatever the you is, it isn't an object hiding somewhere in the machinery. Neuroscientists have mapped the brain in remarkable detail. They know which regions are involved in seeing colors, recognizing faces, forming memories, feeling fear, and planning actions. They can stimulate certain areas and make a person feel a sudden emotion, recall a memory, or move a hand. But despite all of this, there is no place in the brain where everything comes together into a single inner observer. There's no headquarters, no command center, no final screen where you sit and watch the world. Instead, the brain looks more like a busy city. Different neighborhoods do different jobs. Signals are constantly moving back and forth. Things happen in parallel, not in a neat line. Vision doesn't wait for thinking. Emotions don't wait for permission. Decisions begin forming before you are aware of them. This is deeply unsettling because it clashes with how life feels from the inside. It feels like there is one clear me in charge. But when scientists study timing in the brain, they find something surprising. The brain often starts an action before the conscious feeling of deciding appears. Awareness comes in late, almost like a report of what already happened. That doesn't mean consciousness is fake. It means it may not be doing what we assume it's doing. The feeling of being a single self may be more like a summary the brain creates rather than a controller that runs the system. A useful summary, but still a summary. The brain takes countless processes and presents them as one simple story. I saw this. I chose that. I did this. We trust that story because it's smooth and continuous. But smoothness doesn't guarantee truth. It only guarantees that the system is working efficiently. Think about how you describe yourself. You probably say things like, I am the kind of person who likes this, or I decided to do that, or this happened to me. All of these sentences assume there is a single, stable character moving through time, making choices and collecting experiences. But look closely at how that picture is built. Your brain is constantly receiving information from the senses, pulling up memories, generating emotions, and preparing actions. All of this is happening at once, and most of it never reaches awareness. Out of this enormous activity, the brain produces a simple, clean story that ties everything together. That story feels like me. The important detail is timing. The story comes after the events. Experiments show that the brain begins preparing actions before you feel that you have decided to act. Emotions often arise before you can explain why you feel them. Words like choice and intention are added later as part of the explanation. This doesn't mean the story is useless. It's extremely practical. It helps you plan, communicate, and learn from mistakes. But it does mean that the story is not the same thing as the machinery producing behavior. It's more like a description than a cause. Imagine a sports commentator watching a game. The commentator explains what's happening, assigns reasons, praises decisions, and criticizes mistakes. The explanation is coherent and convincing. But the commentator isn't running the game. The game would go on perfectly well without them. In a similar way, the sense of self may be the brain's commentator. It narrates experience, stitches moments together, and gives them meaning. That narration feels central because it's the part you hear. But it may not be the part that's actually in charge. Once you see this, the self starts to look less like a solid thing and more like a story the brain keeps telling moment by moment because it works. At this point, it's important to slow down and be honest about what science actually knows and where it runs into a wall. When people talk about the self as an illusion, it can sound like everything is settled and understood. It isn't. In fact, this is one of the places where our knowledge is surprisingly thin. We know that changes to the brain change experience. Damage certain areas and memories disappear, alter brain chemistry and moods shift, turn off large-scale brain activity, as in deep sleep or anesthesia, and the sense of being someone vanishes entirely. When the activity returns, the feeling of meh comes back as if it had been paused. This strongly suggests that the self depends on physical processes rather than existing as something separate. We also know that the brain does not contain a single center where all experience is gathered. Instead, experience seems to be distributed, built from many interacting systems. The feeling of unity is something that emerges, not something that is stored in one place. But here's where our understanding breaks down. We do not know why any of this activity should feel like anything at all. We can describe the signals, measure the timing, and map the connections, but none of that explains why there is an inner point of view. Why isn't the brain just a complicated machine that works in the dark? This gap is not small, it's enormous. And it's not something we can solve by adding more data in a simple way. The problem is that our scientific tools are designed to measure things from the outside, while experience only exists on the inside. Humans struggle with this because we want clear answers and clean explanations. When we don't have them, we tend to fill the gap with certainty anyway. But the most accurate position here is a humble one. We understand some of the structure, and behavior of the self. But the deepest part of the mystery remains open. One of the reasons this is so difficult to grasp is that you are trying to understand yourself using the very thing you are trying to understand. It's like a camera trying to photograph its own lens, or a knife trying to cut itself. Every thought, feeling, and observation you have about yourself arises within the same system that you are attempting to analyze. This makes the problem inherently tricky. Unlike studying rocks, stars, or other people, you can't step outside your own mind to see it objectively. The observer is part of the observed. Language adds another layer of difficulty. Human language evolved to describe objects, events, and relationships in the outside world, not to explain processes that are simultaneously inside and outside, both happening and observing. When you try to describe the self, words feel inadequate. You can point to your memories, habits, or behaviors, but the thing that feels like you always slips away as you try to pin it down. The self is more like a process or a pattern in time than a fixed object in space. This is why every explanation of the self feels slightly unsatisfying. Philosophers debate, neuroscientists experiment, and yet the sense of I remains mysterious. Even introspection, the closest tool we have to examining the self, only gives stories that the brain has already composed, not direct access to the underlying machinery. Recognizing this doesn't make life meaningless. On the contrary, it can be liberating. Understanding that the self is a process, a constantly changing narrative, not a fixed entity, helps explain why emotions, thoughts, and identities shift over time. It clarifies why people can undergo radical transformations yet still feel continuous. It also illuminates why our sense of control is both real and limited. We act, react, and adapt, but much of what we consider intentional arises from complex systems beyond awareness. The challenge of understanding the self is one of the most profound in science. It forces us to confront the limits of observation, the limitations of language, and the subtle interplay between being and experiencing. Yet it also opens the door to seeing the mind and reality itself in a profoundly new and curious way.